I don't want a useless old woman here while I'm pregnant. Chelsea didn't even lift her eyes from the phone. The glow from her screen cut across her face like a blade. Brian stood beside her, hands in his pockets, nodding the way men nod when they know the speech has already been written without them. You should find a new place to live, Mom, he added, as if he were pointing out rain in the forecast. Something in me cracked, but not loudly, more like a hairline fracture running along old porcelain. I thought about the nights I'd stood in that kitchen making soups for her morning sickness and folding their laundry while the dryer hummed like a lullaby. I thought about a 3-bedroom house with morning light in the front room and a lemon tree that leaned over the fence, the home I sold to help them stand on their own 2 feet. I thought about the garage I slept in, the polite word converted, doing far too much work to cover the truth of cold concrete in January. And I thought about the promise. It's temporary, Mom. The way promises are always temporary when the people making them prefer convenience over memory. Where exactly am I supposed to go? I kept my voice steady. 64 isn't ancient, no matter how Chelsea says it like a diagnosis instead of a birthday. That's not really our problem, Dorothy, she said finally, glancing up. We need the space for the nursery. Her hand drifted to her belly as if she'd invented motherhood. There are senior communities, Brian added, searching my face for a tidy ending. Nice places. You'll meet people your own age. I wanted to ask him what age he thought he belonged to when his fever broke in 2nd grade and I slept on his floor. Or when his father left and I learned how to measure wood and lay vinyl and patch drywall, because houses need care even when men disappear. But the thing about being underestimated your whole life is you get very good at holding your cards close. Fine, I said. I'll be out by the weekend. Chelsea's mouth twitched like victory tastes sour. Brian's shoulders fell in relief. Neither noticed the small private smile I allowed myself when I turned toward the garage and shut the door with a soft click. I stood in the small square of space that had been mine, bed neatly made, boxes labeled in my handwriting, a shelf of cookbooks that smelled like butter and thyme, and exhaled. The ache settled, familiar as an old bruise. Then I opened the notebook where I kept lists, because grief might be chaos, but dignity likes an itinerary. 3 days is a long time if you pack with purpose. I stacked my life into careful shapes, photo albums into a plastic bin, the good tea set wrapped in dish towels, the toolbox my late husband left behind, each wrench and wire cutter a ghost that knew my hand. Outside, the neighborhood did what neighborhoods do. Dogs barked, a delivery van hissed to a stop, a boy clattered past on a scooter. Maple Street had always been middle of the ladder. Tidy lawns with plastic flamingos in summer, cracked sidewalks patched by homeowners, starter houses that absorbed first paychecks and last illusions. Lately, though, the street had begun to change its clothes. New roofs, a speed bump, a neighbor's for sale sign that came down quicker than a sneeze. People called it improvement. Improvement is a nice word when you can afford it. The lease downtown went through the way butter melts quietly, then all at once. A 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building with a crooked mailbox and a stairwell that smelled faintly of old coffee. Nothing fancy. But when the manager handed me the keys and said, "Welcome home," the words loosened something in my chest. I didn't tell Brian until the moving truck backed into the driveway and the men lifted my mattress, the one I'd bought after my husband died because grief needs a place to lie down. "You found a place that fast?" Brian sounded like the discovery of my competence was a personal affront. "Amazing what you can accomplish when you're motivated," I said, and kissed his cheek. The skin there was stubbled and hot. He looked tired, a kind of tired sleep can't solve. Chelsea watched from the kitchen window, her face flattened against the glass by sunlight. Regret is a late bus. It may come, it may not, and either way you'll be waiting with your coat on. I climbed into my car, shut the door, and let the slam remind me that I still belonged to myself. My hands trembled a little on the steering wheel, but the tremor wasn't fear, it was velocity. The apartment welcomed me with a square of bright afternoon light on bare wood floors. I set my boxes down and opened a window. Downtown air arrived with the hum of buses, a snippet of someone's radio playing a Motown song, and the clink of plates from the cafe below. The room didn't know me yet. I would teach it. I unpacked the kettle first because tea is the first bandage and my favorite armchair second. A lemon-scented candle, the photo of Brian at 8 years old with a trophy bigger than his torso. The urge to cry rose like a tide and receded, leaving only damp sand. My phone rang. "Dorothy Mitchell," the caller said, crisp and professional. "This is Sarah Chen from Hudson Properties, calling to confirm your references. Mr. Hudson is pleased to have you as our property manager." My heart didn't race, it steadied. "Wonderful," I said, leaning back in the chair that already remembered my shape. "When would he like to start the inspections?" "Tomorrow, if you're available. He's particularly interested in a property on Maple Street, 1247. Maple Street." A familiar house number stepped into the room and sat on the arm of my chair like an old cat that had finally come home. "Oh yes," I said, the words dressed in neutral tone, shoes on and hair combed. "I'm very familiar with that property." After we hung up, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the window, the city reflected over my shoulder. "Here's to new beginnings," I told the woman in the glass. She raised her glass back, eyes level, mouth calm. Younger women break loudly. Older women learn to break like light through blinds striped, disciplined, falling exactly where they intend. People will call what came next revenge, because revenge makes a better story than consequence. But the truth sits plainer. Weeks earlier, after Chelsea started calling me help to her friends and left her plates wherever her mood dropped them, I began to consider exits. I read neighborhood bulletins the way other people read obituaries, looking for names I knew. I learned that infrastructure improvement meant trenches and tape and a bright orange notice stapled to a utility pole no one really looked at. I learned that young couples like to convert garages into dens and nurseries, and that friend of a friend work rarely came with permits. I learned that when development arrives dressed as opportunity, the first thing it does is count who can pay the cover charge. I didn't intend to feed my son to a developer. I intended to be the quiet buffer I had been for most of his life, filling out forms that exhaust him, calling offices with hold music that kills his patience, smoothing corners he bumps into. I had already spoken to a contractor, already penciled the $8,000 into my own budget like a gift I would never label as such. But I am done giving to people who call me useless while wearing the sweater I folded for them. The day they asked me to leave, my plan changed shape, as plans do when you discover the ground you're walking on isn't ground at all but a rug someone is willing to pull. In the garage, before the last box, I touched the wire I'd helped run along the studs, the neat little pathway of order I'd designed with my husband in a kitchen remodel from another decade. He taught me to pull cable with a steady hand and to turn off the breaker because safety isn't a suggestion. Brian had learned some of that at his father's knee, then set it down when life asked him to carry other things. I don't judge, I simply count. Night fell quickly downtown, like a curtain willing to speed up the second act. I made soup in a pot small enough for one person and played the radio to keep the walls company. Outside, someone laughed. A high, bright sound that didn't belong to my life, but didn't offend it either. I ate at the little table by the window, the spoon tapping the bowl, the rhythm of a woman who has put herself back in her own hands. Then I stacked the bowls, wiped the counter, set my alarm, and slid between sheets that smelled like fabric softener and the future. When sleep found me, it wasn't the restless kind with dreams that keep pacing your hallway. It was full, a velvet drop. In the morning, I would meet Will Hudson in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Maple Street. He would be exactly what men like him always are, shirt crisp, calendar full, charm deployed in measured teaspoons. I would be exactly what I have always been prepared. I turned off the lamp. The room darkened, as if someone drew a line under this chapter, neat and decisive. Somewhere in the city a siren wailed, somewhere else a baby cried, and somewhere on Maple Street a woman arranged pastel paint chips in a stack that looked like spring. I didn't wish her harm. I wished her wisdom, the most expensive thing we own. "Here's to new beginnings," I said again into the dark, and let the words settle into the ceiling like stars you can't see but know are there. The next morning dawned sharp and clean, the kind of spring day that made even cracked sidewalks look forgiving. I dressed with deliberate care, navy slacks, pressed blouse, the small pearl earrings that never shouted but never went unheard either. The coffee shop sat 3 blocks from Maple Street, its windows steamed with the breath of morning rush. Inside, baristas clattered pitchers against metal, and the smell of roasted beans tangled with fresh pastries. Will Hudson rose from a corner table when I entered. Mid-40s, the kind of man whose suit carried both comfort and command. His smile was measured, not too wide, the kind that suggested he never wasted an expression. "Dorothy, pleasure to meet in person," he said, offering a hand firm enough to steady, not crush. We spoke for an hour, his tablet glowing with diagrams of neighborhoods like puzzle pieces waiting for rearrangement. Will wasn't a man buying houses, he was orchestrating an aria of property, sewer lines, fiber optic cables, and zoning permissions. Where others saw cul-de-sacs, he saw corridors of investment. "This block," he tapped, "will triple in value once the infrastructure work begins. Good for sellers, not so good for anyone clinging without a safety net." I sipped my coffee and listened. The music of redevelopment has a tempo: demolition, noise, dust, temporary road closures, tax assessments like unexpected drumbeats. Most families don't know the score until the music is too loud to talk over. Then he opened the file. 1247 Maple Street, my son's address staring back at me in digital ink. "You mentioned the owners might be interested in selling," Will said, his tone neutral. I chose my words like stones across water. They're young, first-time buyers, stretched thin. From what I observed, they live paycheck to paycheck, despite decent jobs. And the property? Well, the garage conversion probably wasn't permitted. Not a lie. I'd helped string wires with Brian's friend Dave, a man who thought permits were just paperwork meant for people without confidence. Will's eyes lit up, stylus scratching across the screen. "Perfect. Quick cash offer, 30-day close." Families like that often appreciate flexibility. By early afternoon, I was walking the familiar driveway at 1247 Maple, clipboard in hand. The azaleas I planted years ago bloomed defiantly against the foundation. Chelsea's face appeared in the kitchen window, shock pressed into every line. Brian answered the door, his shirt wrinkled, hair sticking up like he'd fought with a pillow all night. "Mr. Mitchell," Will began, extending a business card. "Will Hudson, Hudson Properties. This is Dorothy, my property assessment consultant. We'd like to discuss a business proposition." Brian blinked at me, confusion rippling across his face like a boy trying to do algebra without paper. "Mom?" His voice cracked, unsteady. "Hello, Brian," I said evenly. "May we come in?" Chelsea waddled in from the living room, one hand on her swollen belly. When her eyes landed on me, the blood drained so quickly I thought she might faint. "What is she doing here?" "Dorothy is my mother-in-law," she explained to Will, her voice thin. "Was?" I corrected softly. "I was asked to leave, remember? Mr. Hudson offered me employment, and I mentioned this property might be of interest." Silence, the kind that makes the tick of a wall clock deafening. We sat in the same living room where, days earlier, Chelsea had called me useless. Now Will spread documents across the coffee table, his tone efficient, merciless in its neutrality. "We're prepared to offer you $450,000 cash, closing in 30 days. Chelsea gasped. They had paid $380,000 18 months ago, half with the money from my house. A quick profit dangled in front of them like a lifeboat. Brian stammered, "We're not looking to sell." Will cut him off smoothly. "Understandable. However, the entire block is scheduled for redevelopment, infrastructure upgrades, sewage, electrical, fiber. Construction will be extensive dust, noise, limited access." He paused, watching the dread gather in their faces. "And of course there's code compliance. Many properties here have unpermitted modifications." His eyes flicked toward me knowingly. Chelsea clutched Brian's arm, knuckles white. "You have until Friday to decide," Will said. "After that, conditions will be less ideal. My card." When we rose to leave, I trailed Will toward the door, but lingered a moment on the threshold. The light slanted across their living room, catching dust motes that floated like suspended seconds. "Take care," I said warmly. "I truly hope everything works out for the best." Outside, the sun was blinding, the air sharp with possibility. I let myself feel the smallest ember of satisfaction, not revenge, not cruelty. Just the balance of scales finally tipping, heavy with all the years I'd carried them alone. Friday would come quickly. Choices reveal character, and character, once revealed, doesn't hide again. The first call came before I had even reached my apartment door. Brian's number, blinking insistently on the screen. I let it slide into voicemail. By the time I'd brewed my evening tea, 2 more missed calls joined it. Chelsea's voice sharp and panicked on one, Brian's again on the next. I sipped slowly, as if the steam might erase years of unpaid debts. On the 3rd attempt, I answered. His voice was high-pitched, ragged. "Mom, what the hell is going on? That man Hudson, he's talking about tearing up our neighborhood." "Language, Brian," I said calmly, the way I'd once corrected him for slamming doors. "And Hudson isn't tearing anything down. He's improving. Property values will rise. We don't want to sell. We just bought the house." His words tumbled, desperate. "With my money," I reminded gently. $40,000 of my retirement savings. Money I'll never see again. The silence on the line was thick. "Mom," he whispered finally, "I know we hurt you." "Hurt?" I laughed, but it was sharp and hollow. "Hurt is accidental. You made a decision. You threw me out the moment I became inconvenient. That's not hurt, that's clarity." He stammered something about hormones, Chelsea's stress, the pregnancy. I cut him off. "Don't you dare use her condition as a shield. She showed me exactly who she was, and you showed me who you are when you chose her comfort over your mother's dignity." His voice cracked. "So what, this is revenge? You're trying to force us out of our home?" "Brian," I said softly, "the city was always coming. Hudson was always coming. The only difference is that I stopped protecting you." The line went dead. Hours later, pounding rattled my apartment door. Through the peephole, Chelsea's tear-streaked face appeared, mascara trailing down like ink on paper. I opened the door but did not step aside. She launched into apologies without preamble. "Please, I was wrong. I was stressed. I didn't mean it." Her voice cracked into sobs. "You can't destroy our lives over one mean comment." "One mean comment?" I repeated. "You spent 6 months making me invisible in my own son's house. You barred me from dinners, whispered to your friends about how I was just help. You called me useless. And when I asked where I was supposed to go, you said it wasn't your problem." She clutched her belly, trembling. For a moment, something inside me almost softened almost. "We're family," she pleaded. "You can't just walk away." "No," I said quietly. "Family doesn't throw each other out like trash. You made sure I knew I wasn't family." Her voice broke into a wail. "Then what do you want? How do we fix this?" I studied her carefully. The question wasn't really for me, it was for herself. The moment when desperation cracks the shell and truth leaks out. "It can't be fixed," I said finally. "You can't unring a bell." Her face twisted, anger threading through fear. "So that's it? You'll ruin us?" I didn't answer. Some truths don't require words. Minutes later, Brian arrived, breathless, red-faced. "Mom," he began, "Chelsea said you admitted you planned this." "I admitted no such thing," I corrected. "Hudson was already developing. I simply stopped shielding you from the consequences." He stared at me, confusion tightening his jaw. "What does that even mean?" I walked to the kitchen drawer and returned with a manila folder, thick with papers. I laid them on the coffee table between us, like a deck of cards no one wanted to play. "This," I said, tapping the top page, "is the city's notice from 3 months ago. Your entire block was being evaluated for infrastructure improvements. Every property would need to be up to code before work could begin." Brian's face drained. He skimmed the letter, lips moving silently. Chelsea snatched it next, her hands trembling. "I was contacted because I contributed to your mortgage down payment," I explained. "The previous owners forwarded the notice through their agent. I've been handling it quietly for 6 weeks. I even arranged a contractor. $8,000, 2 weeks of work. I was going to cover it. My gift. Before I moved out." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel in your teeth. You never told us," Brian whispered. "I did," I said. "Do you remember in February when I asked about permits, when I offered to help with paperwork? You brushed me off. I didn't press because Chelsea's pregnancy was already difficult. I thought protecting you quietly was easier." Chelsea's voice cracked. "But you didn't finish the work." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "I was asked to leave before I could." Brian collapsed onto my couch, strings cut, face buried in his hands. Chelsea pressed a hand against the folder as if holding it down might erase what it contained. The truth sat between us, undeniable, unmovable. For once, I let the silence do my work. You see, I said finally, my voice calm. Hudson was always coming. Development was always happening. The only difference was whether you'd face it with me beside you or alone. Neither of them answered. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight shift from my shoulders back onto theirs, where it belonged. The call came on a gray morning, the kind where clouds press low enough to feel personal. I was unpacking books when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Dorothy Mitchell? The woman's voice was clipped, professional. This is Patricia Hayes, loan officer at First National. Your son listed you as an emergency contact. We're reviewing his request for a home equity line of credit. I sat down slowly. A line of credit? Yes, to cover unexpected expenses. However, our appraiser noted structural modifications without permits, specifically a garage conversion. Until compliance is resolved, we can't approve additional lending. Mr. Mitchell indicated you were overseeing the permit process? I closed my eyes, exhaling through my nose. Brian, ever the optimist when it came to rewriting reality. Miss Hayes, I said carefully, there's been a misunderstanding. I am not currently involved in any such process. A pause. I see. Thank you for clarifying. After we hung up, I stared at the phone in my lap. Even now, after everything, Brian still assumed I existed to fix what he broke. Some lessons simply refused to land. Minutes later, he called. His voice was tight with accusation. Mom, Patricia said you refused to help with the permits. I didn't refuse, I said evenly. I corrected her misunderstanding. I had everything arranged when I still lived in your house. 8,000, a contractor ready. That died the day you asked me to leave. This is insane, he shouted. You're destroying us over hurt feelings. Something inside me snapped, clean as a branch in winter. Hurt feelings? Brian, I sold my home to help you buy yours. I lived in a garage and paid rent. I cooked your meals, folded your clothes, and stayed out of your wife's way while she called me useless. When I needed family, you chose her comfort over my dignity. And now, when you need something, suddenly I'm family again. The silence on the line stretched until it broke. He hung up. 2 days later, another knock at my door. When I opened it, I found Chelsea's parents, Frank and Linda Morrison, standing stiffly in my hallway. I hadn't seen them since the wedding, when I'd smiled through a toast that already felt like prophecy. Dorothy, Linda began, wringing her hands. We need to talk about Brian and Chelsea. I invited them in, made coffee, and waited. Frank got straight to it. Chelsea called us in tears, said you moved out after some disagreement. She claims you're upset about not being involved in the baby planning, and now you're pressuring them through this developer. She's 8 months pregnant, Dorothy. The stress isn't good for her or the baby. I set my cup down carefully. Is that all she told you? They exchanged glances. She said you wanted to stay in the garage permanently, Linda added gently. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I rose and pulled the manila folder from the drawer, laying its contents across the table. Here is the city notice from 3 months ago. Here is the contractor's estimate I arranged. Here are the documents showing I was ready to cover the costs myself. As they read, color drained from Linda's face. Frank's jaw tightened like a man grinding stone between his teeth. She called you useless? Linda whispered. Among other things. Frank slammed his palm against the table. That little we raised her better than that. I nodded. But people reveal themselves when comfort outweighs gratitude. Chelsea made her position clear. Brian chose to stand with her. Linda leaned forward, her voice low. Dorothy, what would it take to fix this? Not just the permits, but the family. I studied her tired, sincere eyes. She wanted a solution because mothers always do, even when the problem doesn't belong to them. Some things can't be fixed, I said softly. Character reveals aren't temporary lapses, they're truths. And truths don't go back in the box once spoken. Silence. Only the clock ticked. Finally, Frank stood. So what happens now? Now, I said, folding the documents back into their folder. They deal with the consequences of their choices just like everyone else does. They'll likely sell to Hudson, make a profit, and move somewhere they can afford. The baby will be fine. And maybe, just maybe, they'll learn what respect costs. Frank nodded grimly. Linda dabbed at her eyes. At the door, Frank turned back. For what it's worth, Dorothy, you're handling this right. We'll be speaking to our daughter. When they left, the apartment felt different, lighter. I sat with my cooling coffee, realizing that for the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. Sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing the wound. Sometimes it comes from accepting the scar. It was a Monday when the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't family, it was Will Hudson. His voice, usually brisk and sure, carried an edge. Dorothy, we've got a problem. Someone filed a formal complaint with city planning. They're accusing Hudson Properties of intimidation tactics. My chest went cold. Who? Frank Morrison, Will said. Retired city council. Apparently still has friends at City Hall. The city is launching an investigation. They want to interview everyone involved in acquisitions. That includes you. Of course it did. I set my tea down with a steady hand that betrayed the tremor inside. Frank, trying to shield his daughter the only way he knew, by pulling political strings. I should have seen it coming. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again. Mrs. Mitchell? Detective Sarah Chen, with the City Planning Compliance Office. We'd like to schedule an interview. When? Today, if possible. The conference room was sterile white walls, fluorescent lights humming, a recorder's red eye blinking on the table. Detective Chen was younger than I expected, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that doesn't need volume to command. She began plainly. Mrs. Mitchell, explain your relationship with Hudson Properties. I told her. The consulting role, my knowledge of the neighborhood, the property inspections, and your relationship to Brian and Chelsea Mitchell at 1247 Maple? They're my son and daughter-in-law, I answered evenly. She stopped writing, her pen poised. You recommended your son's property for acquisition? I identified it as a property in need of improvement. Yes. After being asked to leave that same property? So they knew. Of course they did. I met her gaze. Detective, are you familiar with the code violations at 1247 Maple? She consulted her folder. Unpermitted garage conversion? Yes. I spent 6 weeks arranging permits and contractors. $8,000 worth of work, ready to begin. I was asked to leave before it could happen. Hudson Properties contacted me afterward. Development was coming regardless of my involvement. She leaned back, studying me. Some people might see this as revenge, Mrs. Mitchell. I let the words hang in the air, then answered quietly. And some people might see my son's actions as elder financial abuse. I provided factual information already documented by the city. If that helped Hudson make an informed decision, I call it consulting work. Her pen scratched again. The interview went on for 2 hours, questions about timelines, motives, my role. I answered each one with calm precision. The truth was my shield now. As she walked me to the door, she lowered her voice. Off the record, family disputes like this rarely end well for anyone. I met her eyes. Off the record, sometimes people need to learn that actions have consequences, even when those people are family. 3 days later, Will called back. Relief flooded his words. The city closed the investigation. No fraud, no coercion. Your work was entirely appropriate. And the complaint? Withdrawn, he said. Frank Morrison called this morning, apologized for wasting their time. Apparently he had some enlightening conversations with his daughter. I held the phone tight, a weight lifting from my chest. But even as relief spread, a knock came at my door. Through the peephole, I saw Brian and Chelsea, both looking like they'd aged a decade in a week. I opened the door, but didn't invite them in. Mom, Brian said quietly, we owe you an apology. Chelsea's voice followed, barely above a whisper. Several apologies. I waited. My parents told us what you did, Chelsea continued. How you tried to protect us, how you were fixing everything. And we... Her throat closed, tears pressing. We threw it all away, Brian finished. Yes, I said simply. You did. Can you forgive us? Chelsea asked, eyes red, voice trembling. I let the question settle, heavy in the air. Forgiveness was easy when you didn't mean it. But forgiveness that cost something, that demanded respect, that was another matter entirely. I can forgive you, I said finally. But I can't forget what you showed me when you thought it was safe to be cruel. They looked down, shame pooling in the silence. "We want to make it right," Brian said desperately. "How?" I asked. They exchanged glances, empty-handed. "We don't know," Chelsea admitted. "Then think about it," I said. "Really think. Because this isn't about fixing me. It's about fixing who you are." Their shoulders sagged. For the first time in months, the power in the room belonged to me, and I intended to hold it. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign stood in their yard like a surrender flag. Will Hudson's offer had held steady. $450,000 cash. After the mortgage and closing costs, Brian and Chelsea walked away with $60,000 in their pockets, money enough for a smaller house in a neighborhood more suited to their reality, not their ambition. I didn't gloat when I drove past Maple Street and saw strangers' cars in the driveway. I didn't need to. That chapter had already written itself. The baby came in late summer, a healthy little girl with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced her presence without hesitation. They named her Dorothy. I'll admit, the first time I heard it, I sat in silence, the name heavy as a stone in my chest. Was it a tribute? An apology? Or just their way of tying me to the future after cutting me out of the present? Maybe all three. 6 months passed before I agreed to have dinner with them again. Not because I was punishing them, but because boundaries need time to set like concrete. At the table, Chelsea served roast chicken and glanced at me often, as if checking my temperature. Brian asked about my new job with Hudson Properties, about the apartment I'd filled with books and plants, about the community center, where I'd started teaching basic home repair to women my age who were tired of waiting for someone else to fix things. Our conversations were halting, cautious, but they were respectful, and that mattered more than ease. I told them, family isn't about how much you're willing to endure, it's about what you're willing to require. They listened, quiet for once. Maybe they understood. In time, the sharp edges dulled, not erased, never forgotten, but softened enough for coexistence. We began to stitch together a new kind of family, smaller, steadier, less convenient, but more honest. One afternoon, as I fed the baby in her high chair, she reached for me with tiny hands and said her first word, "Gamma." The sound cracked, something open in me, not like porcelain this time, but like sunlight through clouds. I cried, shamelessly, because I knew she would grow up in a family that had learned the price of disrespect and the value of dignity. Chelsea treats me with civility now, because she's learned what happens when she doesn't reading. Brian makes his own decisions without expecting me to sweep in with a mop for his messes. And me? I live in my own apartment, work a job I enjoy, and carry my boundaries like armor that gleams instead of weighs me down. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's refusing to be a victim ever again. And in the quiet of my own space, when I hear that little girl's voice call for me, I know that what survived wasn't bitterness. It was strength.